Sometimes life pushes you so far into a corner that you're willing to believe in miracles. Today, I want to tell you about James Mitchell, a 25-year-old man from Oakland, California, whose life was about to change in the most unexpected way imaginable. You see, James wasn't just any 25-year-old. When COVID-19 swept through California like a wildfire, it took his father, Michael Mitchell, with it. In one devastating moment, James went from being someone's son to being the man of the house. His mother, Linda, was battling diabetes and high blood pressure, conditions that required expensive medications and constant doctor visits they couldn't afford. His younger sister, Sarah, was in her final year at Stanford University, brilliant as the morning sun, but drowning in tuition fees that seemed to grow bigger every month. Every morning, James would wake up at 5 a.m., not to chase his dreams, but to chase survival. He'd spend his days delivering food for DoorDash, weaving through Oakland's busy streets, racing against time to make enough for gas money and groceries. When the sun went down, he'd switch to driving for Uber, picking up late-night riders, listening to their stories while his own heart was breaking. But even that wasn't enough. 3 nights a week, he'd work security at a warehouse in West Oakland, spending lonely hours walking through empty corridors, fighting to stay awake. Weekends? Those were for construction work, back-breaking labor under the California sun that left his hands raw and his spirit worn thin. James was running on maybe 3 hours of sleep a night, surviving on gas station coffee and pure determination. But determination doesn't pay bills, and hope doesn't cure diabetes. The debt collectors had started calling. Not just calling, threatening. Every ring of his phone made his heart race. "Mr. Mitchell, this is your final notice," became the soundtrack to his nightmares. They threatened to take their little apartment in East Oakland, the only home they had left. They threatened to repossess his car, his lifeline to every job that kept them afloat. James never complained. Not once. He'd smile at his mother when he brought her medicine, telling her everything was going to be okay. He'd encourage Sarah during their late-night phone calls, assuring her she'd graduate, even though he didn't know where next semester's money would come from. But inside, he was drowning. Then came that Tuesday afternoon in July, a day that started like any other, but ended like something out of a dream, or maybe a fairy tale. James had just finished a particularly difficult delivery downtown, carrying heavy bags up 4 flights of stairs to an apartment where the customer didn't even tip. His back ached, his stomach growled, and his gas tank was running on fumes. He pulled into the parking lot of Mama's Kitchen, a little soul food restaurant that reminded him of his grandmother's cooking. It was the kind of place where you could get a plate of fried chicken, mac and cheese, and collard greens for $8. If you were lucky. James walked inside, the smell of comfort food wrapping around him like a warm hug. He stood at the counter, fishing through his pockets for crumpled dollar bills, counting them twice to make sure he had enough. $7.32. Just enough for the special. That's when he noticed something strange through the restaurant's window. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom had pulled up outside, the kind of car that costs more than most people's houses. In Oakland, you didn't see cars like that unless someone was filming a music video or a movie star had gotten very, very lost. But what made James's blood run cold wasn't the car. It was the fact that someone inside was watching him. Through the dark-tinted windows, he could feel eyes on him, studying him like he was some kind of puzzle to be solved. The car door opened, and James's world shifted. Out stepped a woman who looked like she'd walked straight out of a magazine. She was elegant in a way that money couldn't buy. The kind of elegance that comes from years of power and confidence. Her silver hair was styled perfectly. Her jewelry caught the afternoon light like captured stars, and she moved with the grace of someone who'd never questioned whether she belonged anywhere. This was Mrs. Margaret Richardson, though James didn't know it yet. What he also didn't know was that she was one of the most powerful African-American businesswomen in the country. Her empire stretched across real estate, technology, entertainment, and logistics. She was worth more money than James could count, more money than he could even imagine. And she was walking straight toward him. James froze as she entered the restaurant. The conversations around them seemed to quiet, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. She approached the counter where James stood, still clutching his wrinkled bills, and said in a voice as smooth as silk, "You're James Mitchell, aren't you?" James blinked hard, wondering if the exhaustion was finally making him hallucinate. "Yes, ma'am," he managed to whisper. "But how do you know my name?" She studied his face with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "I know about your mother's medical bills," she said quietly. "I know about your sister's tuition at Stanford. I know about the 3 jobs you work just to keep your family afloat. I know about the debt collectors who call you every night." James took a step back, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Ma'am, I don't understand. How could you possibly know all that?" Her smile was mysterious, almost sad. "Because I've been watching you, James. And if you're willing to listen, I can change your life forever." The busy restaurant suddenly felt silent. James felt like he was in a movie, like none of this could possibly be real. What do you mean?" She looked directly into his eyes, and what she said next would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. "I want you to marry me." Time stopped. The world tilted. James was sure he'd misheard her. "Marry you?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "A legal marriage," she said firmly. "Fully documented, completely official. In return, I'll pay off every single debt your family has. I'll cover your sister's tuition through graduation. I'll get your mother the best medical care money can buy. I'll give you a life where you never have to worry about money again." James stared at her, searching her face for some sign that this was a joke, a cruel prank, a hallucination brought on by too much stress and too little sleep. But her eyes were steady, serious, completely sincere. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do this for a complete stranger?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, thick, cream-colored paper with gold lettering that caught the light. "Call this number when you're ready to hear the whole story," she said. Then she turned and walked out of the restaurant as gracefully as she'd entered. James stood there, frozen, watching through the window as she got back into the Rolls-Royce and disappeared into the Oakland traffic. He looked down at the card in his trembling hand. Margaret Richardson, CEO, Richardson Enterprises. Below that, a phone number that would change everything. That night was the longest of James's life. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at that card, while his mother coughed in the next room, and his phone buzzed with another threatening call from a debt collector. Sarah called, crying, because Stanford had given her a 48-hour ultimatum. Pay up or drop out. And then, the next morning, 2 men in black suits knocked on their apartment door. Loan sharks. James had borrowed money from the wrong people when his desperation had reached its peak, and now they wanted it back. With interest. The kind of interest that breaks kneecaps. "You've got 1 week, kid," one of them said, his voice cold as winter. "Pay up, or you'll wish you had." James closed the door, his hands shaking, and looked at that business card one more time. He had no choice. He had nothing left to lose. With trembling fingers, he dialed the number. 2 days later, James found himself on a first-class flight to Los Angeles, pinching himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. A black SUV met him at LAX and drove him through the winding streets of Beverly Hills to a courthouse that looked more like a palace. Inside, surrounded by lawyers, photographers, and witnesses he'd never seen before, James stood beside Mrs. Margaret Richardson. She looked like a queen preparing for a coronation, radiant and powerful and completely sure of herself. And there, in front of a judge and a room full of strangers, James Mitchell signed his name on a marriage certificate, officially becoming the husband of one of the most powerful women in America. But as the photographer's flashes lit up the room, and the lawyers shook hands, and the witnesses signed their names, James felt something cold settle in his stomach. This was too easy, too perfect, too much like a fairy tale. And everyone knows that the best fairy tales always hide the darkest secrets. As they drove away from the courthouse in that black Rolls-Royce, heading toward a Beverly Hills mansion that would make the Hollywood tours jealous, James couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just signed more than a marriage certificate. He'd signed his name to a mystery, and he was about to discover that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The Richardson mansion in Beverly Hills was like stepping into another universe. We're talking about golden chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses, marble floors imported from Italy, and gardens so vast you could get lost in them for hours. James had his own wing of the house, a space bigger than any apartment he'd ever dreamed of living in. But here's the thing about paradise. Sometimes it feels more like a prison. From day one, something felt off. The staff moved through the mansion like ghosts, always polite, always professional, but never really present. They called him Mr. Mitchell with perfect courtesy, but their eyes never quite met his. It was like they were all afraid of something, or someone. And then there was the door. On the second floor of the mansion, there was a room that was always locked. Not just locked, secured with 3 electronic locks and guarded by security personnel around the clock. Whenever James asked about it, the answer was always the same. "Sorry, sir. That room is private. Mrs. Richardson's orders." Mrs. Richardson herself remained a mystery. During the day, she was all business, taking calls with executives in London and Tokyo, managing her empire with the precision of a master chess player. She treated James with kindness, but it was the kind of distant kindness you might show to a houseguest, not a husband. They had dinner together every evening in a dining room that could seat 20 people. Just the two of them at opposite ends of a table that felt like an ocean. She'd ask about his comfort, his meals, his health. But the conversations never went deeper than surface politeness. They were married on paper, but they were strangers in every way that mattered. Still, James tried to focus on the positives. His mother, Linda, had been flown to the best medical facility in California. For the first time in years, her diabetes was under control, her blood pressure was stable, and she had round-the-clock care. Sarah was back at Stanford, her tuition paid in full, her future secure. The debt collectors had vanished like bad dreams in the morning light. But at night, lying in silk sheets in a bedroom bigger than his old apartment, James would stare at the ceiling and wonder, who is Margaret Richardson really? Why did she choose me? And what is she hiding behind that locked door? 3 weeks into his new life, James met Emma. She was Mrs. Richardson's personal assistant, a warm, intelligent woman from Sacramento who'd been working for the family for 5 years. Unlike the other staff members, Emma smiled. She didn't seem afraid of Mrs. Richardson. She seemed genuinely fond of her. One evening, as Emma was organizing books in the mansion's library, James approached her. "Emma," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" She looked up with kind eyes. "Of course, Mr. Mitchell. I'd like to spend more time with my wife. I feel like I don't really know her yet, but I don't know the right way to ask." Emma's face lit up with genuine joy. "That's wonderful. Mrs. Richardson has been hoping you'd say that. She talks about you often when you're not around." James was surprised. "She does?" "Yes," Emma smiled. "She's been waiting for you to show interest in getting closer. I'll speak to her right away." Within minutes, Emma returned with a message that would change everything. "Mrs. Richardson would like to see you in her private quarters at 10 p.m. tonight. She said she's very happy you asked." That evening, as James prepared for what he hoped would be a breakthrough moment in their strange marriage, he had no idea he was about to uncover a secret that would shake him to his core. At exactly 10 p.m., he walked to Mrs. Richardson's private wing. When she opened the door, James felt like he was seeing her for the first time. Gone was the silver-haired businesswoman. In her place stood someone who looked decades younger. Her hair was thick and dark, her skin glowed with vitality, and her eyes sparkled with life. She wore elegant loungewear and moved with the grace of a woman in her prime. For a moment, James couldn't even speak. "Come in, my dear," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "I've been waiting for this moment." The room was nothing like the rest of the mansion. It was cozy, intimate, filled with soft music and candlelight. They sat together on a comfortable sofa, and for the first time since their wedding, it felt like they were actually connecting. "Mrs. Richardson," James said softly, "how is this possible? You look so different, so young." "I don't understand." She smiled with a warmth he'd never seen before. "Age is just a number, James. When a woman is truly cared for, something magical happens. Her soul becomes timeless." That night, she told him stories he never expected to hear. How she'd grown up poor in a small town in Northern California. How she'd started with nothing but a catering business run from her tiny apartment kitchen. How she'd faced racism and sexism in the business world, but kept pushing forward. How she'd built her empire through sheer determination and brilliant strategy. But she also told him about the loneliness. How men had used her, lied to her, wanted her only for her money. How she'd given up on finding real love. "I never thought I'd meet someone who looked at me with genuine kindness," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Not pity, not greed, just kindness. James found himself opening up too. "I came into this marriage for practical reasons," he admitted. "But sitting here with you tonight, I realize I don't know who you really are. But I want to." Mrs. Richardson's eyes filled with tears. "For 40 years, I've been hiding pieces of myself. Tonight, I want you to see the real me." They talked until dawn, not about business or money, but about dreams, fears, hopes, and heartbreak. James began to see her not as a wealthy older woman who'd rescued him, but as someone who'd fought her own battles and still carried hope in her heart. 3 beautiful days followed. For the first time since their wedding, James felt like their relationship was becoming real. They laughed together, shared meals that felt like conversations between friends, and slowly began to trust each other. But even in those perfect moments, that locked door haunted him. It whispered questions that he couldn't ignore. What was she still hiding? Why was that room so important? Why was everyone so afraid to talk about it? On the 4th day, opportunity knocked. Mrs. Richardson had flown to New York for an emergency board meeting, taking most of the senior staff with her. The mansion felt unusually quiet, almost empty. That morning, James found himself drawn to the 2nd floor like a magnet pulls metal. As he approached the forbidden room, his heart nearly stopped. For the first time since he'd lived there, the door was slightly open. James hesitated. His hands shook, but the need for answers was stronger than his fear. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. What he found nearly brought him to his knees. It wasn't an office or a bedroom. It was a shrine, a memorial. The walls were covered with hundreds of photographs, newspaper clippings, business articles, and handwritten letters. The room was frozen in time, preserved like a museum of memories. James walked deeper into the room, his heart pounding like thunder. He picked up a framed photograph from the central table. His hands began to shake violently. In the photo was his father, Michael Mitchell, standing arm in arm with a much younger Margaret Richardson. They were at what looked like a beach resort, smiling, clearly in love. James's father looked happy in a way James had never seen him. He picked up another photo, Michael and Margaret at a formal business event, dressed elegantly, holding hands, gazing at each other with obvious affection. And then he found the letters. Dozens of them, written in his father's handwriting. Margaret, you are the strongest, most incredible woman I've ever known. I love you more than I thought possible, even though the world may never understand us. I promise, someday I'll make this right. James dropped the photo. The truth hit him like lightning striking his soul. His father and Mrs. Richardson had been lovers. Before he could process what this meant, he heard a soft voice behind him. So, you finally found it. He turned around. Margaret was standing in the doorway. She'd returned early from New York. She wasn't angry or surprised. She just looked tired, like someone who'd been carrying a crushing secret for far too long. I've been waiting for you to open that door, she said quietly. James stared at her, his world spinning off its axis. You knew my father. I didn't just know him, she whispered, walking slowly into the room. I loved him with everything I had. She picked up one of the photographs, holding it like it was made of precious glass. We met when I was 45 and he was 35. Your father helped me build parts of this empire. He made me believe I deserved to be loved. James's voice cracked. What happened? Margaret took a shaky breath. We were together for 5 years. Secretly, because he was worried about what people would say. I didn't care about the age difference, but he did. When I finally proposed to him, when I told him I wanted to spend my life with him, she paused, pain flickering across her face. He told me he couldn't marry an older woman. He said people would call him a gold digger, that it would ruin his reputation. He said he cared about me, but not enough to face the world's judgment. The room fell silent except for their breathing. James felt like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. So you married me to get revenge on him, he said quietly. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. I was so angry, James. For 40 years, I carried that anger. When I found out Michael had a son, I watched you from a distance. I saw your struggles, your pain, and I waited for the perfect moment. Her voice broke completely. I wanted to control you the way your father had controlled me. I wanted to make you feel small and powerless, just like he made me feel worthless. James felt like his chest was caving in. Everything, the rescue, the mansion, the help for his family, it had all been part of an elaborate revenge plot against his dead father. So this was all a lie, he said, his voice barely audible. Everything you said to me, everything we shared, it was all part of your plan. Margaret looked up, her eyes red with tears. It started that way, yes. But then something unexpected happened. She stepped closer to him. Every time you showed me kindness without wanting anything in return, something inside me began to heal. Every time you listened to my stories without judgment, every time you looked at me and saw a person instead of just a wealthy woman, the anger started to fade. Her voice became softer, more vulnerable than he'd ever heard it. I don't know exactly when it happened, James. Maybe it was when you asked to spend more time with me. Maybe it was that night when we talked until sunrise. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as Michael's son and started seeing you as the man who showed me what real love could feel like. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. James closed his eyes, thinking about all their conversations, the warmth in her voice, the way she'd looked at him during those candlelit dinners. Could someone who'd planned revenge really fall in love? Could something that started in darkness become genuine light? When he opened his eyes, he said the words that would define the rest of their story. I forgive you. Margaret collapsed. She fell to her knees, sobbing like her heart was breaking and healing at the same time. I don't deserve your forgiveness, James. I don't deserve your kindness. He helped her to her feet and said something that surprised even himself. Maybe not, but forgiveness isn't about what you deserve. It's about choosing peace over pain. From that moment forward, everything changed. There were no more secrets, No more locked doors, no more walls between them. Margaret told him everything about her life. The struggles, the victories, the loneliness, and the dreams she'd almost given up on. James forgave her completely, not because she'd earned it, but because he chose healing over hatred. Over the next several months, Margaret taught him about business, about leadership, about building something meaningful. James became more than her husband. He became her true partner, helping her run the empire with compassion instead of just ambition. But life had one more chapter to write. 6 months after that day in the memorial room, Margaret became ill. The doctors said it was her heart, not just physically, but emotionally. Decades of carrying anger and pain had finally caught up with her. In her final days, she held James's hand and said, "You healed a wound that was older than you are. You showed me that love is stronger than revenge, and forgiveness is more powerful than anger." She passed away peacefully, surrounded by people she'd learned to trust and love. At her funeral, James spoke with trembling hands and said, "Margaret's love was complicated, but it was real. She taught me that sometimes the people who enter our lives for the wrong reasons can still leave the right kind of mark on our hearts." But this story doesn't end with sadness. A year later, James married Emma in that same Beverly Hills mansion. But now it wasn't cold and mysterious. It was warm and full of laughter. His mother, Linda, moved into the house, her health completely restored. His sister Sarah graduated from Stanford and became a key executive in one of the family companies. The house that had once been a shrine to revenge became a home built on love, forgiveness, and second chances. From James and Margaret's story, we learn something profound. Sometimes love begins in the most broken places. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones carrying the deepest wounds. And sometimes, forgiveness isn't just a gift we give to others. It's the key that unlocks our own freedom. James could have chosen anger. He could have walked away when he learned the truth. Instead, he chose to see Margaret's pain behind her revenge, her loneliness behind her wealth, her hope behind her fear. And in doing so, he didn't just change her life. He discovered who he truly was. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories don't start with "once upon a time." Sometimes they start with "I forgive you." And sometimes, that's exactly where the real fairy tale begins.